Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are opening up a file that is absolutely massive. It's part adventure story, part intellectual revolution, and honestly, it's got enough drama to fill a dozen tabloids.
Oh, at least.
We are looking at a figure who didn't just study culture. She became a culture unto herself. We are talking about the one and only Margaret Mead.
It is genuinely impossible to overstate her footprint.
Right.
I mean, when most people hear the word anthropologist, the image that pops into their head is Margaret Mead.
Yeah, the cape, the stick.
Exactly. And she wasn't just an academic writing for other academics and, dusty journals. She was a celebrity. She was a cultural icon who fundamentally changed how the Western world thinks about things as personal as adolescence, sex, and gender.
She really was an icon. I mean, that look she had later in life, the cape, the big walking stick, she looked like a wizard or something.
She cultivated that image.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. But the reason we're doing this deep dive today isn't just because she was famous. It's because the questions she asked, almost 100 years ago now? They are the exact same questions we are screaming at each other about on the internet today.
That's it. That is the mission of this deep dive. We want to unpack the life of the woman who was, arguably the most significant public voice in anthropology in the entire 20th century.
Okay, and for that, we have sources. What are we working with?
We have pulled together a serious stack. We've got her biographical records. We've got her own ethnographies, which are surprisingly readable, by the way. She was a great writer.
That's rare for an academic.
Very. And we also have the academic critiques that tried to, destroy her reputation, and her private letters, which reveal a very different side of her than the public knew.
And I have to say, just reading through the biographical stuff, the sheer adventurousness of this woman is staggering.
It's incredible.
I mean, picture it. It's the 1920s. She's in her early 20s. And she decides, you know what? I'm going to go to American Samoa.
Alone.
Alone. That is not a casual trip today. In 1925, that is like going to the moon.
It was incredibly bold, but she wasn't just going for the thrill of it, She was going on a scientific mission.
Right.
And to understand why she went and why her work just exploded the way it did, we have to frame this around the heavyweight title fight of the 20th century, nature versus nurture.
The classic battle. Is it our DNA or is it our upbringing, our biology or our culture?
Exactly. And Mead walked right into the center of that battlefield. Her work became the primary ammunition for the argument that culture nurture plays a much, much bigger role than biology.
So she's Team Nurture.
She is the captain of Team Nurture. Yeah. And this concept of cultural relativism, that there isn't one right way to be human, that was the hill she planted her flag on.
Okay, I love that framing. And for you listening, the learner, as we like to call you, stick with us. We're going to move beyond the dry academic dates and facts. We want to get to those specific aha moments about human behavior that Mead uncovered. And we are absolutely going to get into the messy stuff, the controversies, and the secrets.
Because science is rarely a straight line, and Margaret Mead's life certainly wasn't.
Okay, so let's jump in. Section 1, the Samoan bombshell.
The big one.
We have to start with the book that made her famous, Coming of Age in Samoa. So set the scene for us. It's 1925. Where exactly is she?
Okay, so she arrives in American Samoa, specifically on the island of Tau in Manua Archipelago.
So remote.
Very remote. And you have to remember the context of the Western world at this time. In the U.S. and Europe, educators, psychologists, philosophers, they all held a very, very specific view about teenagers.
Which was what? That teenagers are universally nightmares.
Essentially, yes. That's a good way to put it. The prevailing wisdom was that the emotional turbulence of adolescence, the angst, the rebellion, the mood swings, was biologically inevitable.
Hardwired.
Exactly. They believed that because the body is changing during puberty, the spirit must inevitably be stormy. It was treated as a fact of nature, like losing your baby teeth.
So if you were a parent in 1925, the experts were telling you, look, your kid is going to be miserable and difficult, and there is nothing you can do about it because it's part of the human blueprint.
That was the hypothesis. That was the accepted truth. And Mead, who was a student of the great Franz Boas,
the father of American anthropology.
The father of American anthropology, yes. She went to Samoa specifically to test that. She had a very simple but profound question. Is this emotional turbulence biologically inevitable, or is it a product of society?
Nature or nurture?
Exactly. Because if she could find just one place, anywhere in the world, where teenagers weren't miserable,
then the whole biological theory falls apart.
The whole thing collapses.
So she embeds herself in Samoan life. She's living there. She's learning the language, watching the girls, taking notes. What did she actually find?
She found a world that was radically different from 1920s America, just fundamentally different.
In what ways?
Well, first, she observed that children in Samoan society were largely ignored until they were about 15 or 16.
Ignored.
Yeah, I mean, they were cared for, but they weren't the center of the universe like, say, an American child might be. They had very little social standing. But paradoxically, that lack of standing gave them effectively greater freedom.
That's interesting. So because they weren't important, nobody was breathing down their necks all the time.
Exactly right. There wasn't this intense pressure to succeed, to conform, to decide your entire future at age 14. They existed. They did their chores, they played.
And that lack of pressure made a difference.
A huge difference. But the biggest difference, and this is the one that made the book a sensation, was the attitude towards sex.
I feel like we can't talk about Mead without talking about this.
Yeah.
She described a society that was, let's say, much more relaxed than the U.S. at the time.
Relaxed is a good word. She described a society with what we would call casual, non-monogamous relations.
So sleeping around was just normal.
For young, unmarried people, yes, it wasn't seen as a moral crisis. She also noted that the Samoans were much more comfortable with biological realities. Things like menstruation, which were, totally hush-hush and shameful in America, were just facts of life there.
No stigma.
A distinct lack of what she called sexual neuroses. There wasn't all this guilt and anxiety and fear wrapped up in it.
And she explicitly writes about love affairs among unmarried young people.
She does. She paints this picture of, love under the palm trees. She detailed how adolescents had the freedom to experiment with different partners. It was seen as a normal part of growing up, of learning about relationships.
So it wasn't about finding the one right away.
Not at all. It was about exploration. She even noted that homosexual relationships were present and were not stigmatized in the way they were in the West.
Really?
Yeah, it was viewed as part of that playful, experimental phase of life. It wasn't about identity. It was just an experience.
Now, was it a total free-for-all? Or were there some rules?
Oh, there were definitely rules. It wasn't anarchy. She specifically mentions the topo.
The what?
The topo. She was the ceremonial princess of the village. And the topo absolutely had to be a virgin. The honor of the entire village depended on it.
Okay, so there was a double standard there, in a way.
A very specific one, tied to rank and ceremony. But for the average girl, the restrictions were minimal. The main concern was avoiding pregnancy outside of a stable relationship, but the act itself wasn't seen as sinful.
And so the aha moment she reaches is massive. She's looking at these girls who are going through puberty, same hormones, same bodily changes as American girls, but they aren't having breakdowns.
Exactly.
They aren't fighting with their parents. They aren't miserable and angsty.
They're growing up. Mead concluded that adolescence in Samoa was not stormy. It was perhaps the most peaceful and easy time of a person's life. Therefore, teenage angst is cultural, not biological. It is a product of our specific civilization, our specific pressures, our monogamous traditions, and our specific hang-ups about sex.
That is a huge mic drop for 1928.
It's an earthquake.
It basically told American parents and the whole establishment, your kids aren't miserable because they're teenagers. They're miserable because of how we live.
It was revolutionary. It shifted the blame from biology to society, and it made her famous, overnight famous. But we have to address the elephant in the room, because decades later, this entire body of work came under very, very heavy fire.
Enter Derek Freeman.
Derek Freeman, a New Zealand anthropologist. And when I say he was her critic, I mean he made it his life's work to dismantle her legacy.
Wow.
He published 2 big books, one in 1983 and another in 1998 after Mead had died, notably just attacking her findings from every possible angle.
Okay, so what was his core argument? Did he just think she misinterpreted some things?
He went much, much further than that. He argued that Mead was either deliberately lying, which is a huge charge, or, and this is the more famous claim, that she was hoaxed. Yes. He famously claimed that the young Samoan girls she interviewed had been pulling her leg. It's called the hoaxing theory.
So the idea is they were just telling her these wild, told tales about their sex lives because they thought it was funny.
That's the theory, that she was this naive, young American woman, and they were just having a laugh at her expense.
And what was his version of Samoa?
He painted a picture of a society that was the polar opposite of Mead's. He claims Samoa was actually characterized by extreme sexual repression, a rigid, puritanical Christian morality.
The opposite of casual.
The total opposite. He also pointed to high rates of violence, of assault, and adolescent delinquency. He described a society that was strict, competitive, and punitive.
Okay, so we have two completely contradictory accounts. Who was right? Did the academic world just turn on her after she died?
It was a massive controversy. I mean, this was on the cover of Time magazine. It was a huge public debate. But within the anthropological community, the dust has settled somewhere in the middle, though leaning pretty far away from Freeman's most extreme claims.
How so?
Well, most experts rejected his harshest criticisms. They pointed out a few key things. First, Freeman did his fieldwork decades later. He was there in the 1940s and again in the 60s.
That's a long time after 1925.
A very long time. And in that period, the islands had been heavily influenced by Western missionaries and, just as importantly, by World War II.
So he was looking at a different Samoa than she was. The culture had changed.
Precisely. Also, he was a man. An older man asking questions about sex. She was a young woman asking other young women. The kind of access and information they would each get would be totally different.
That makes sense.
So the consensus now is that, look, maybe Mead idealized things a bit. Maybe she simplified the picture to make her point more powerfully.
She was making an argument, not just taking notes.
Exactly. She had a thesis to prove. But was she fundamentally wrong? Was Samoa a violent, repressed society in the 1920s? Most anthropologists today would say no, Freeman's portrayal was the one that was more skewed. Her central thesis that culture shapes personality remains valid.
So she survives the scandal, at least in the academic world. But she didn't just stop there in Samoa. She kept moving.
Oh, she was just getting started.
And that brings us to Section 2, redefining gender. Because if you think her take on teenagers was radical, her take on men and women in the 1930s was absolutely wild.
This is my favorite part of her work because it's so incredibly structured and elegant in its argument.
Okay, so where does she go after Samoa?
She goes to the Sepik River watershed in Papua New Guinea. This is between 1931 and 1933. And this time she is there with her then-husband, Rio Fortune.
We'll get back to it later.
We will. But together, they produce a book called Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies. And the key here is the three.
Right. She studies 3 different tribes in the same geographic region to compare and contrast them.
Yes. She treats it almost like a natural laboratory experiment. She wants to know, is being a man or being a woman a universal thing? Do these roles look the same everywhere?
Spoilers, they do not.
They absolutely do not.
So let's break down the 3 cultures she found, because they are just wildly different. First up, the mountain Arapesh.
The Arapesh. Okay, so Mead described them as a society where both men and women displayed traits that Westerners at the time would have considered exclusively feminine.
Meaning what exactly? What does a feminine society look like?
They were gentle, they were responsive to the needs of others, they were cooperative. Aggression was deeply frowned upon for everyone.
So no tough guys.
No. In fact, an aggressive man was seen as abnormal, as a social deviant. And crucially, both the fathers and the mothers were deeply involved in child rearing in a very nurturing way.
Both parents were maternal.
Exactly. So in Arapesh society, being a good man meant being gentle, cooperative, and maternal.
Okay, so that's tribe number 1. Then she goes, what, down the river?
Literally down the river, and she finds the Mundugumor, who are also known as the Biwat.
And they were different.
They were the complete polar opposite of the Arapesh. She found that in this society, both men and women displayed traits that Westerners would call masculine.
So everyone was a tough guy here.
Everyone. She described them as aggressive, violent, non-nurturing. They were ruthless in their interactions. Hostility and suspicion were the norm.
Wow. What about child rearing?
It was almost an afterthought. Babies were seen as a nuisance. There was very little warmth or affection from either parent. Both the men and the women were expected to be tough, combative, and individualistic.
So in the first group, everyone acts like a stereotypical 1930s good mother.
Mm-hmm.
And in the second group, just a few miles away, everyone acts like a stereotypical warrior.
Exactly. A fascinating contrast. But the third group is the one that really flips the script.
The Chambuli.
Now called the Chambri, yes.
This is the famous role reversal one.
It is. In Chambuli society, Mead observed a near-perfect reversal of Western gender roles of the time. The women were the dominant partners.
Dominant.
They were the ones with the shaved heads, which was a sign of their status. She described them as brisk, efficient, practical, business-minded managers. They controlled the fishing and the marketplace. They provided the food. They ran the show.
So they were the breadwinners, the bosses.
The bosses. They were impersonal and in charge.
And the men, what were they doing?
The men were the artists. They were the ones concerned with aesthetics and ceremony. She described them as being emotionally dependent on the women.
And catty. I saw that in the sources.
That was her word. She said they spent their time gossiping, engaging in petty rivalries, and worrying about their appearance wearing elaborate curls and ornaments. They were focused on whether the women approved of their art and their looks.
That is, I mean, for 1935, that must have been absolutely mind-blowing to read.
It was a bombshell. And here is the aha moment, the genius of the book. Mead synthesized this perfectly. She argued that temperament, what we might call personality or gender expression, is not linked to biological sex.
Because if it were biological, men would be aggressive everywhere.
Precisely. If biology dictated that men are leaders and women are followers, then the Chambuli wouldn't exist.
Right.
If biology dictated that women are naturally nurturing and men are not, the Arapesh wouldn't exist.
So she comes to this really revolutionary conclusion. If one tribe can make everyone gentle, and another can make everyone aggressive, and a third can make men feminine and women masculine, then we can't say that passivity is naturally female or aggression is naturally male.
Right. She basically laid the groundwork for the modern distinction we make between sex, the biological parts you're born with, and gender, the social role you learn to play.
The costume you wear.
The costume your culture hands you. She showed that a society can take a biological male and mold him into a gentle nurturer, or take a biological female and mold her into a dominant, aggressive leader. The possibilities are, as she put it, endless.
It connects so directly to modern thought. I mean, the conversations we are having right now about gender fluidity, about non-binary identities, Mead was providing the cross-cultural data for that 80, 90 years ago.
She was. She was doing it by physically stepping outside her own culture to see that the rules we live by aren't laws of nature. They're just stories we tell ourselves.
Which is a powerful idea. Now, speaking of how she gathered this data, she was also innovating the actual tools of the trade.
She was.
And that takes us to Section 3, Visual Anthropology and the Ethics of Observation. Because she realized at some point that writing things down in a notebook wasn't enough.
No, especially when you're studying things that are nonverbal, like dance or religious trances or the subtle ways a mother holds a baby. You need to see it.
So where does this innovation happen?
This happens in Bali from 1936 to 1938, and this time she was with her third husband, Gregory Bateson.
Bateson. Okay, so he's on the scene now. And in Bali, they went heavy on the tech.
Massively heavy. For the time, it was cutting edge. They took 25,000 photographs.
That's 25,000.
And they shot 22,000 feet of film. This was just, it was unprecedented in anthropology.
How did they even process all that in the field? That's an incredible amount of material.
It was a monumental effort. But the goal was to capture what they called culture at a distance, to create a truly objective record.
What was the methodology like? Were they just pointing a camera at things?
It was much more systematic than that. The method was fascinating. Mead would be sitting there with her notepad, scribbling these rapid-fire, moment-by-moment notes about the social interactions.
Okay.
While Bateson, who was a brilliant photographer, operated the camera, capturing the same moments on film, so later they could sync the visual record with the written observation.
That's a whole new level of data collection.
It was, and works like their film Trance and Dance in Bali come from this period. It really birthed the entire field of visual anthropology.
But Mead didn't just take snapshots of cultures. She was also one of the first to commit to long-term study, right?
Yes, and this is another one of her major contributions. We have to talk about her work with the Manus people in the Admiralty Islands.
This is the longitudinal study, the one where she kept going back.
She did. She first went in 1928, and then she returned over and over again for 5 decades. She wrote the book New Lives for Old in 1956, and it was a stunning document.
Why? What did she see?
She watched a society move from what we'd call the Stone Age to the Atomic Age in a single generation.
That's an incredible amount of change to witness firsthand.
It was, and she was there for some of the most dramatic parts of it. This is where we get the story of the noise.
The noise, what was that? It sounds ominous.
It was a cargo cult phenomenon.
I've heard that term. What does it mean?
It was a kind of millenarian religious event. After World War II, the villagers had seen all this incredible Western technology, the cargo from the military bases, and a movement arose believing that a new age was coming instantly.
And how would this new age arrive?
Supernaturally. They believed their ancestors would return on ships or planes, bringing the cargo with them. And to prepare for it, they had to destroy their old world.
Destroy it.
They destroyed their traditional possessions, their tools, their masks, their ritual objects. They threw them into the sea. Mead describes them shaking like leaves, caught up in this religious fervor, believing that the Western goods and way of life would just appear.
That is terrifying and fascinating. They destroyed their own history, hoping for a new future.
It was a radical, desperate act, but what's so interesting is how it evolved. It didn't just fizzle out. It turned into something called the Paleo movement.
It was Paleo.
Paleo was a local leader, a visionary, and he channeled that desire for change into a political movement. He pushed for a new way, in the local TikTok Pisan language, Nufalahasan.
And this wasn't about magic anymore.
No, it was practical. It was about embracing Western-style governance, building schools, opening clinics. It was a push for modernization from within, on their own terms. And Mead documented the entire arc from magical thinking to political action. She showed how a culture can completely rewrite its own operating system when it decides to.
That's an incredible story. However, we can't look at this era of her research without seeing some of the cracks in the ethical foundation.
No, we can't.
We need to talk about the somatotyping studies.
Yes. This is the darker side of the research, and it's important to confront it. In 1953 and 1954, Mead and her team were interested in body types. You know, the idea of endomorph, mesomorph, ectomorph.
Right, the different body shapes.
They wanted to see how body type might relate to personality and cultural adaptation.
And to study body types, you need to see the body.
You need to see the body. They took nude photographs of the villagers, hundreds of them.
Okay, this is where the modern listener goes, whoa, did they consent to this?
And that is the absolute core of the controversy. Critics, like the anthropologist Leonora Forstall, have pointed out that consent was often sought from the Australian colonial authorities.
The government.
The colonial government, yes. Not necessarily from the villagers themselves in a way we would consider informed consent today.
So the government said go ahead, and the subjects just had to deal with it.
Essentially. There's a huge power imbalance. Now, Mead defended it later in her life. She viewed it as United Nations business, which is a strange phrase. She argued it was medically useful and necessary for science.
But that doesn't really hold up now.
Not at all. Looking back, it highlights the extractive nature of some of that early anthropology. It's the Western scientists treating indigenous people as data points, as specimens. It's a part of the history we absolutely have to acknowledge.
And that wasn't the only instance of questionable methods, right?
Yeah.
There was an issue with the Omaha fieldwork.
Yes, this was earlier, in 1930, in Nebraska. She was studying the Omaha tribe. Her husband at the time, Rio Fortune, was working openly as an anthropologist. But Mead decided to go undercover. Undercover? She posed merely as his wife. She felt that if she was seen as another researcher, the Omaha women would clam up and wouldn't give her the real story.
But as just a wife, she could sit with him, gossip.
And get the information nobody else could.
Yeah.
Exactly. She used that access.
And what did she learn?
She described the Omaha as a broken culture. She was heartbroken by what she saw, the devastating impact of the Dawes Act, the loss of their land, the economic ruin, the social collapse. She saw people whose culture had been shattered by government policy.
So it's complex. She was exposing this horrible injustice that was done to them, but she used a level of deception to do it.
Precisely. The ethics are murky. The slogan, "the personal is political," was a thing in the 70s, but it applied to Mead's work in her life decades earlier.
That's a perfect transition, because that brings us to section 4. We cannot understand her work without understanding her private life. It was complicated.
That's an understatement. For someone who made a living studying marriage, kinship, and family structures, her own kinship chart was, let's call it a spider web.
It was. Okay, so she had 3 husbands. Let's run through the roster.
First was Luther Cressman. She married him in 1923. He was a theology student who later became an archaeologist. She later referred to it as her student marriage.
That feels a little dismissive.
He certainly thought so. But they were very young. It was a marriage of its time, and it ended when her career took off, and he wasn't part of that vision.
Then came husband number 2, Rio Fortune.
Rio Fortune, the New Zealand psychologist and anthropologist, the collaborator we mentioned in New Guinea.
The one she was with for the big gender studies.
Yes. And by all accounts, that was a volatile, brilliant, and incredibly difficult marriage.
How so?
Sources describe him as possessing a puritanical jealousy. He was intensely competitive with her. He was brilliant, a great intellectual partner, but reportedly also physically violent.
Wow.
It was a partnership of work, but a nightmare of a relationship. It burned very hot and then burned out completely.
And then number 3, Gregory Bateson.
The Englishman.
Yep.
Gregory Bateson, he was the soulmate.
And how do they meet? This is where the drama really kicks in.
It is. They met while she was still married to Fortune. In fact, while all three of them were doing fieldwork together on the Sepik River.
Wait, all three of them?
All three of them. In the field. In New Guinea. Imagine the tension in that tent.
That is a reality show waiting to happen.
It truly is. She and Bateson fell in love. She divorced Fortune and married Bateson.
And that was the longest marriage.
It was. From 1936 to 1950. They had her only child, a daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, who also became an anthropologist. And when that marriage ended, when Bateson left her for another woman, Mead was absolutely devastated.
Really?
Completely. The sources say she never really got over it. She kept his photograph by her bedside for the rest of her life.
So the husbands are a huge part of her story.
Yeah.
But they're only half of it.
Not even half, really.
We have to talk about the women in her life.
Yes, we do. And this is where the sources, particularly her letters and biographies written after her death, are very clear, even if he wasn't always public about it at the time.
Let's start with the big one, Ruth Benedict.
Ruth Benedict, another giant of anthropology. She was Mead's instructor at Barnard College, her mentor.
And her lover.
And her lover, yes. They were partners. It was an intense, lifelong intellectual and romantic relationship. Benedict was probably the most important single person in her life.
And later in life, she had another long-term female partner.
She did. After Bateson, she lived with the anthropologist Rhoda Mitro from 1955 until her death in 1978. Their published letters concern a deep, loving, romantic relationship. They were life partners.
It's amazing how much of her life was about challenging norms, both in her work and in her home.
They were one and the same for her.
There's that one anecdote that I think sums up her attitude perfectly, the story about burning the letters.
Oh, the beach scene, yes. Before she went to Samoa, she had a pretty intense relationship with the famous linguist Edward Sapir.
Okay.
But he was very traditional. He wanted a wife who would stay home, support his career. He was completely unsupportive of her ambitions to go into the field.
You wanted to put her in a box.
Very conventional box. So when she finally got to Samoa, this moment of liberation for her, she took all his letters, went down to the beach, and burned them.
She literally set fire to the past to clear the way for her future.
It's so cinematic. It's a declaration of independence.
Now, with all this complexity, did she ever label herself? Did she call herself bisexual or lesbian?
She actively refused labels. She never openly identified as lesbian or bisexual in the way we might use those terms today. When pressed, she called herself a mixed type.
A mixed type. What did she mean by that?
It was her way of saying she wasn't one thing or the other. There's a famous quote from a friend of hers who observed that Mead loved women's souls and men's bodies.
Wow. Spiritually homosexual.
That's how the friend put it. It's a fascinating distinction, suggesting an intellectual and emotional intimacy with women and a different kind of connection with men.
And she had a whole theory about this, about life stages.
She did. This is so ahead of its time. She suggested that a perfect balance for a human life might be to have homosexual relationships in your youth for exploration and intimacy,
Okay.
then heterosexual relationships in midlife for the purpose of procreation and raising a family.
Right.
And then returning to homosexual relationships in old age for companionship.
Wow. Talk about fluidity. She's not just talking about being one thing for your whole life. She's proposing that your orientation can and should evolve as you age.
It's a radical idea even today, and she was writing about this in her Red Book column.
Wait, hold on. She's writing about this in Red Book, the magazine at the grocery store checkout.
Yes. In the 60s and 70s, she had a column where she brought these anthropological ideas to a massive mainstream American audience. She wrote a column where she said, and I'm paraphrasing, bisexuality isn't something new, but the acceptance of the human capacity to love members of both sexes is.
Bringing it to the masses.
She believed that the capacity to love wasn't limited by gender, and she wasn't afraid to say so.
That leads us perfectly into our final section, Section 5, the public intellectual.
Oh.
Because she wasn't just a researcher hiding in an ivory tower. She was a brand. She was a public voice.
She was, and World War II played a huge part in cementing that role.
How so? What did she do during the war?
She served as the executive secretary of the Committee on Food Habits for the National Research Council.
Food habits. That sounds a little boring for Margaret Mead.
It sounds boring, but it was crucial. It was about understanding American dietary patterns to improve nutrition and morale for the war effort. How do you convince Americans to eat organ meats, for example? It's a cultural problem.
An anthropological problem.
Exactly. But she also did more direct work. She wrote manuals on how American troops stationed in the UK should interact with the British.
Oh, I love this. A field guide to the British.
Essentially, she had to explain American courtship rituals, casual dating to the perplexed Brits who had a much more formal system. She was using anthropology as a tool for Allied diplomacy to prevent cultural misunderstandings between the troops.
And after the war, her influence just kept expanding. She got involved in cybernetics.
She was a true polymath. She was a core participant in the famous Macy conferences, which brought together thinkers from all different fields: math, biology, engineering, sociology.
And what was the goal there?
They were trying to develop a universal science of systems, of communication and control. Mead was instrumental in developing what's called second-order cybernetics, the idea that the observer is part of the system they're observing.
Which is what an anthropologist does.
It's the definition of an anthropologist. She saw the whole world, culture, biology, machines as interconnected feedback systems.
She really was everywhere, and her influence reached right into the American home, specifically through Dr. Spock.
A huge, huge influence. Dr. Benjamin Spock was actually her pediatrician.
Her daughter's doctor.
Yes. And her observations in the field that babies in so-called primitive societies were fed on demand, not on a strict by-the-clock schedule, directly influenced him.
So the idea of feeding your baby when it's hungry?
Instead of letting it cry for hours because it's not time yet, that came in large part from Mead's cross-cultural work. Spock promoted breastfeeding on demand based on her research.
So if you weren't left to cry it out in a crib, you might have Margaret Mead to thank.
You might. Exactly.
And there's one more kind of strange cultural trope she is allegedly responsible for creating.
The Jewish mother stereotype.
Really? How did that happen?
Allegedly. It's debated, but the story is she was involved in a research project studying shtetls, the old Eastern European Jewish villages. It was funded by the American Jewish Committee.
Okay.
The study, which was part of her national character research, described a mother figure in that culture who was intensely loving, but also controlling, smothering, and guilt-inducing through her use of food and affection.
That sounds familiar.
It does. And that academic description allegedly seeped out into the popular culture and became the comedic and sometimes problematic trope that we know today.
It is wild how many different threads of modern culture you can trace back to her work.
She was recognized for it, too. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. It was awarded by President Carter posthumously in 1979.
A fitting honor. So let's wrap this up. We have unpacked the Samoan bombshell, the gender revolution of the Sepik River, the visual innovation in Bali, the controversies, the ethical questions, and her incredibly complex personal life.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. If we look at the big picture, what was her ultimate contribution?
I think it's that she moved anthropology from the measurement of skulls and pottery shards, which is a lot of what it used to be, to the study of childhood, personality, and gender. She humanized the science.
And despite the Freeman critique, despite the ethical questions about the photos, what is the core takeaway that still stands?
The takeaway is her central thesis, the one she started with in Samoa. That culture shapes us as much as biology, maybe more.
That we're not just products of our genes.
We are not just products of our genes, we are products of how we are raised, what our society values, what anxieties it has, and what stories we are told about who we are supposed to be.
That's a powerful thought. It means we have agency. If we created the culture, we can change the culture and therefore change ourselves.
That's the hopeful message at the core of all her work.
Exactly. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We talked about Margaret Mead's own proposed ideal for a human life. A society where sexual orientation and gender roles could evolve fluidly throughout a single person's lifetime.
It's a radical idea.
It is. And I want you to ask yourself, is our current society, right now, closer to her vision? Or have we just swapped one set of rigid rules for another? Are we truly becoming fluid, or are we just busy creating new, smaller, more specific boxes to put ourselves into?
That is the question she would want us to be asking.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and mind of Margaret Mead. It's been a journey.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.